Hello and welcome to Meeting People with me, Amal Pandya. Meeting People is a podcast where I have long conversations with rebellious, adventurous and sometimes courteous free spirits. Herr Dr. Niemitz, thank you very much for sparing the time, or Kristian as most people know you by.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I thought we would, before we get into the meaty stuff, just start with a little bit on your journey. So you're economist by training, you went to university in Berlin.
Yes.
How have your economic views shifted over time? Or have you always been a kind of purist free marketeer from day one?
No, I don't think anyone was. Being a free marketeer is very much an acquired taste.
Yeah.
And that's where free marketeers, classical liberals, differ from people elsewhere on the ideological spectrum. You can be instinctively a socialist. I guess most people are instinctively socialist.
Yeah.
You can be instinctively conservative. You cannot really be instinctively liberal. It's something that you have to learn about. It's a much more cerebral ideology, and that's because it doesn't, unlike other ideologies, it doesn't have a basis in evolutionary psychology. You know, we have evolved as tribal creatures, and a lot of our moral intuitions are wired in that way, whereas classical liberalism and free market economics requires you to think more abstractly about how an economy works, how society works. Things like market exchange, that's something which our primitive ancestors 100,000 years ago wouldn't have known.
Yeah.
Things like the rule of law, that you have say an independent judiciary where you are innocent until proven guilty and all that. These are relatively recent innovations in human history, and that's is all counterintuitive. Our instinct tells us that if somebody has done something wrong, we want to crush the bad guy, or if we see somebody having much more wealth than somebody else, we want to take it from the one who has it and give it to the other. So our intuitions are not easily compatible with classical liberalism. That's why it's always a journey. But it has the advantage that if you ask a liberal, a free marketeer, how did you develop those views, they can tell you something about a journey, whereas a socialist would mostly just tell you, well, I've always felt that way. And then at some point I found a book that articulated what I've always believed. So in my case, I was initially a typical teenage commie, meaning I was sort of left-wing, but I was more into the aesthetics, but didn't really know anything about it.
Yeah.
Even though I did have the collected works of Marx and Engels and Lenin, but didn't really read it except for a couple of pages and thought, well, this is
all good stuff.
Unpleasant.
Yeah.
Love it, but I'm
Yeah.
not going to read it. Drawn to the aesthetics, the vibe of it rather than the content really, and just realized over time that actually I quite liked the market economy. So I read something when I was maybe 17 or 18, a short book by an economics journalist who described concepts like the invisible hand of the market in very simple terms. So just the idea that in market exchange...
What's the book, sorry, just so people know?
Well, I don't think it's ever been translated into English.
It's German, okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
So it would translate as something like the market economy as a goodie bag, or
Right. Fine.
and yeah, it's aimed at a beginner's audience, very simple terms, but it's all about stuff that you would now think, well, that's totally trivial, but at the time when you've never really thought about how the economy works, it's mind-blowing. The idea that you can have people who are maybe not particularly altruistic, might not care about your well-being per se, but they nonetheless offer you goods and services that you want and are prepared to pay for, and act as if they were good people, act as if they were interested in your well-being. That was mind-blowing at the time. I never thought about it in that way, and it explained how in market competition you have different providers who compete with each other and try to convince the customer, buy our stuff, not theirs. And I just started applying that to things I saw around me, and started to see that pattern in the real world, where I had previously just not thought about it at all before. That you would go into a supermarket, all the shelves are full, all nice stuff, most of it reasonably priced, and I had just prior to that never thought about why that happens. It's all the stuff is just somehow there.
So there's a story, isn't there, about, I think it was Boris Yeltsin when he was in the before the wall came down, and he was visiting Texas as part of the kind of easing off, and he visited a supermarket. It was either him or Gorbachev, but he visited a supermarket and was just like, oh wow, like a tear came to his eye. He didn't the propaganda that they'd received was that the Americans are kind of living in, apart from a few elite corporate bourgeoisies, they're living in poverty, just like us. And then he realized that kind of the game was up.
Yeah, there's that famous photo of him standing there, throwing his hands up and looking delighted. It's not even a particularly nice supermarket. It's a fairly well, probably
it's like an Aldi or something. Yeah.
I guess yes, but nonetheless, I guess yes. If you come from the Eastern Bloc, that must have been mind blowing. For me, it was kind of the opposite. Whereas for him, visiting a supermarket was a formative experience, I guess, or something that shocked him at that stage. For me, it was growing up in the West. I just took it all for granted. I just took wealth, widespread availability of great goods and services, took that completely for granted, never once thought about why this happens.
Was the generation above you in Germany a bit more attuned to that? Because there was that kind of perfect experiment east between west, where one side people are trying to escape desperately, and the other side has no interest in going to the other side. Obviously not everyone in Germany is a free market capitalist. But,
no, very much not.
Yeah. So, but did that inform your kind of perspective that the older generation were much more attuned to this sort of age of plenty that they'd come into?
I think that was so I'm late Generation X, born 1980. I think even for Gen Xers, that was still a thing that even in the 90s, or perhaps more so, because even though the GDR obviously no longer existed as a state, as a country, in a sense, unification made it more visible. It was now basically in the newspapers all the time that there were transfers of billions from the West to the East, and that was all because of the legacy of socialism, the legacy of the planned economy. In a way, reunification made that more visible because it was now the West that had to clean up the legacy cost of socialism. So yes, that was definitely a thing if you were politically aware, if you thought about these things, which until I was 17, 18, I just didn't do. But once I got into thinking about economic life in such terms, yes, that also was an influence that you would constantly have. Well, and also at the time, if you traveled, you could still absolutely see the difference between East and West with the naked eye. You didn't have to know the GDP figures. But when I then later moved to Berlin, and I lived in the East for most of that period, so 2001 to 2007, at that time you could still absolutely see the difference between East and West Berlin. It was very easily visible. Or
was that cheaper rent as a student?
Well, that was one of the positive side effects of it, yes. But it was also cheaper for a reason, and a lot of it still looked very commie. It looked, it had parts that looked dystopian, you could say. Although I loved the dystopian vibe as well. Of all the Soviet monuments are still there, and if you have these extremely grim, dark grey tower blocks all around. So it still has that a bit of an Orwellian 1984 vibe to it. So for someone who's interested in the ideology, in that regard, a great place to live. Because I had a weird fascination with socialism that even though I hated the ideology, at least at that stage, I was still fascinated by the vibe of it.
And that's partly because you could feel the human appeal. As you said, your kind of your evolutionary inheritance appeals to a confiscatory approach or a kind of violent approach or kind of playground fairness approach to kind of looking at the world. And so you almost, when you're studying socialism, are you kind of going, God, I could be like this. I can see feel the attraction here, and I have to override it almost with my prefrontal cortex and my more rational brain to kind of go, It's a bit like, I guess, if someone in your family was a victim of a brutal crime, all of a sudden your liberal instincts about capital punishment or prison conditions kind of go out the window, right? And then you have to sort of reground yourself in the principles and go,
the very principle that even that person still deserves a defendant and that there should be an independent judge rather than you going in with a baseball bat. Of course, that takes some restraint, and that's why in a state where in an emotional state where you're heavily invested in an outcome, you shouldn't be the one making the decisions.
So after Berlin, I didn't. You went to Salamanca University.
That was during. That was
okay.
Half a year abroad.
So I recently read Hayek's Nobel Prize lecture, The Pretense of Knowledge, which I know you've written on quite recently as well. And he mentioned the Spanish schoolmen in this lecture. I think it was 1974, wasn't it? So we just had the 50th anniversary last year. The Spanish schoolmen, who I knew nothing about, so I looked them up, and then I saw that in preparation for this that you'd been there. So to Salamanca, can you just explain who they are, what the kind of legacy of Salamanca University is for the ideology that you kind of are?
Yes, so the idea was up until that point, I thought that economics in the modern sense, that it all started with Adam Smith, and that he was the first to describe the principles of market exchange. But then I realized, I can't remember where I saw this first, that there were precursors, there were people talking about this in pre-capitalist, pre-industrialization times, and the Salamanca school, where I guess among the first. They talked about market exchange under, from our perspective, simple primitive conditions, and yes, that was they were proto-liberals. I guess you wouldn't call it that under those circumstances, with liberalism being more of a modern ideology, but early days predecessors, and that was a reason for applying. For that, to do the semester abroad there. It's just, if you do that, you will end up disappointed, because it's not that you see much of the legacy around it. It's not that that would inform
it in the library.
You're not just not feeling it. You also the professors aren't going to mention it. It's not that they will say, okay, here we're in the tradition of the old Salamanca scholars, and here's what that means. So I think one professor mentioned them once briefly, and that was about it. So
it wasn't a legacy that was being upheld. What was interesting about that school was there was a deep kind of Catholic or Christian, or some a kind of branch of Christianity that these were all kind of monks or deeply Christian thinkers. Recently listening to Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook talk about Marxism, and Tom Holland makes the argument that Marxism was effectively another branch of Christianity. It was a confiscated, that kind of utopian element to it, from Pelagius to Thomas More, and that kind of confiscatory element came from Christian texts. So the first should be last should be first, the meek shall inherit the earth, and beware of wealth, and all that kind of stuff. And Marx basically just use science as a tool rather than God as a justification. And so what Tom Holland argues is that Marxism versus capitalism is basically a continuation of Christian wars of religion. Is that oversimplifying it, would you say?
Whether it's specifically Christianity, I don't know, but there is definitely a moralistic impulse which Marx and Marxists in general to this day disguised by saying, no, we're just doing science. We're just like physicists or chemists. We're not dealing with moral judgments. We're just analyzing things the way somebody might analyze the constellation of the stars or whatever, an astronomer. And that is clearly not true. Marxists are clearly driven by a moralistic impulse. They are at a visceral level disgusted by capitalism. and they try to come up with rational sounding explanations for that, but the emotion is clearly there first. And it's also true in Marx himself that he wrote the early revolutionary texts much earlier than he wrote the more analytical parts. So Das Kapital, the first volume came out in the 60s, Communist Manifesto in the 1840s. Right. So clearly the more political stuff is there first, and then the deep, the analysis comes later. Okay. And there is I can't remember his name now. There is a book called Why We Bite the Invisible Hand on the psychology of anti-capitalism. And the author also goes through Marx's own writings over the course of his lifetime and shows right from the start the policy conclusions. That was all there from the very beginning. And the analysis all came much later to justify a conclusion that he had already reached. And so, that's not the way, that's in that way it's very much not scientific.
So the reason I find the kind of it's definitely a religion masked in scientism, or the language of the scientific method. The reason I find that argument has an appeal is because, and we'll talk about, I don't want you to expand on this now, but the reason why Marxists or socialists believe that true Marxism or true socialism has never been tried is if you asked a Christian, has true Christianity ever existed in the has there been a purist or any religious person, has there been a pure manifestation of your creed? And they would always say, no, this wasn't true Christianity, or this society, the Roman Catholic Church isn't real Christian, behavior. And that's what we see now with socialism, where that idea never dies because it's such a religious one. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'd say with most religions, they would say we cannot reach perfection in this life. That's for the afterlife. We can only strive to live in accordance with our moral values, and we will often fail. And that's fair enough. That's why I don't really have a problem with religion outside of fundamentalist sects that try to impose their moral preferences on others. But religion in general, as long as it is mostly about timeless moral principles, no problem with that. They're not trying, nowadays at least, to build that utopia in this world. But of course in the Middle Ages there were, and I'm guessing that's probably what I didn't listen to that Tom Holland episode that you mentioned, but I'm guessing that was what he was basing this argument on, that in the Middle Ages you had religious sects in Europe taking over cities and trying to build religious Christian utopias, and they were also very proto-socialist. So that would involve abolition of private property and market exchange, and they would in that sense be like early socialists. And well, if it's at the city level, fair enough, you can just escape. But if you then try to extend that to a wider society, a wider geographic area, and especially when you then try to make it impossible to escape, then you have a problem.
Do you find it frustrating, therefore, that people believe that socialism's never been tried? Okay, let me put it another way. Has socialism, true socialism, ever been tried?
Yes, many times. It's when people say real socialism hasn't been tried, what they mean is that it hasn't delivered the outcomes that they would like to see, the outcomes that they would expect from a socialist society. But that doesn't mean that there haven't been honest attempts to try it. I'd say
it's probably is it more selfish than that? Is it, if I was in charge as a socialist, then it would have been real socialism. It's just the wrong people were doing it, whereas I'm such a good socialist, therefore I have that ability to kind of plan people's outcomes.
It essentially boils down to that, because the people who present that case nowadays, that would be, say, socialist publications like Jacobin magazine in the US, or Current Affairs magazine, or here in Britain, Novara Media would be an example, and also some people who write for the Guardian. So it's also very much in part of the mainstream media landscape. Those people would distance themselves from all the earlier socialist societies usually, but not from the idea. They will say proper socialism would be completely different, but it will not be able to say what exactly they would do differently. They would just say, well, just trust me, it will be different. I just know that somehow. And that, yes, in a sense, it does boil down to, well, if I was in charge, it would be brilliant.
Yeah, and so they don't understand human nature, which is the moment you centralize power too much, you're just going to get a misallocation of resources and excessive hierarchy and unfairness.
Or basic economics, that there are reasons why economies cannot be planned, why democratic planning is a nonsense idea, but that's basically what it is. The real socialism fallacy. I mean, this is, I guess, a version of the no true Scotsman fallacy, where you say no true Scotsman would commit a murder, but then you're already defining a Scotsman as somebody who doesn't murder others. So by definition, the moment a Scotsman murders someone, ceases to be a Scotsman by that definition. So you're projecting an outcome already into the definition of the thing that you're talking about. And that's what the so-called the modern day socialists, the democratic socialists do. They say, well, socialism is a society which is democratically organized. The economy is democratically organized. The people, in a non-hierarchical way, run their economy. Problem with that is nobody has ever come up with a way to do that. If you have a society, a large-scale society of millions of people, how can they all democratically plan their economy? There's just no realistic mechanism to put that into practice. In practice, it can only mean a small group of technocrats taking charge of things, planning the economy, and that's how socialism always ends up. And even if that's not the intention.
Is there a expert fallacy involved as well, where that kind of lack of distrust of the wisdom of crowds and the belief that a few very intellectual people can, in Whitehall or wherever it is, can guide economic behaviour because they are smarter and more intellectual and they've got better degrees and all the rest?
That was true of some of the early socialists. That was the period of the man in Whitehall really does know best. So the kind of thinking that was, well, in Britain at least, fashionable from, well, it's definitely in the 30s, 40s, 50s. Probably fizzled out a bit later. Nowadays, though, socialists, self-described socialists, would say that they are very anti-elitist. So they would say their version of socialism wouldn't involve centralizing power in Whitehall or wherever the Whitehall equivalent of the Socialist People's Republic of Britain would be. So they would say our kind of socialism is explicitly non-hierarchical and decentralized. So they would no longer put the trust in experts in the way that earlier waves of socialists would have done. But I've just reviewed something for our blog because as it happens, I was at a Wetherspoons the other day, where Wetherspoons has or some of them have shelves of old books. I pulled one of them out, and it happened to be a socialist book from the 30s, where somebody is called The First Workers' Government, where somebody describes a future socialist Britain that is. From his perspective, near future envisages a socialist revolution in 1936, and then talks about a couple of decades later, looking back, this is how that happened. And this author, the future Labour MP, somebody who would become a Labour MP in the 40s, he clearly does have this idea that capitalism is chaotic, it's unplanned, it's haphazard. You have lots of people doing different things. Nobody's in charge of all, nobody coordinates this. If only you had a group of wise men, in his case they are literally based in Whitehall, planning things, then all would be well. And that's why he describes a wave of nationalizations, and then all these nationalized industries, in his example, in his book, become much more productive than they were under capitalism, because you now have somebody in charge who can come up with an overall plan. So he still had this naive belief in planability.
And does that stem from your fellow countryman Nietzsche kind of talked about the kind of the decline of God, or the decline of Christianity, and therefore as that decline happened, the explanatory load let's say, on science or rational thinking or the scientific method was so great when it came to the social sciences, economics in particular, so that no longer was complex human behavior and in multi-million interactions between market participants allowed to be put into the realm of, that's just kind of God's realm, or whatever it is, the realm of we don't understand.
Yeah.
Once that upper limit was removed of like, there's certain things we just can't understand. Therefore, science was then asked to do too much to try and explain, well, we can come using spreadsheets and data to what the right price of coal should be.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, did the decline of religion in some ways kind of bring the appeal of Marxism up, and even though it was religious in its own sense?
I don't know if that's the reason, but it's certainly true that you had, say, if you think back, late 19th century Victorian age or early 20th century, you have this explosion of knowledge in the natural sciences, in physics, in chemistry, biology, and I guess it seems natural that you would then think, okay, these are areas where rather than accepting the blind forces of nature, we are applying conscious, rational thought. We are planning things rationally, and we are using nature to our advantage rather than treating it as something that is God-given. That you would then extrapolate from that and think, why not organize society in that way? Why not organize economic life in that way? Why not apply the same principles? And that's what Hayek is criticizing, that applying the scientific mindset in the wrong area. So Hayek, obviously, being a classical liberal, was extremely pro-science. It's just that everything has its place, everything at the right time. So when it comes to physics, chemistry, biology, then obviously the scientific method is exactly the way to go, and you want to apply rational principles. It's just that when you're dealing with individual people, then that's a very different story. And people who have a volition of their own, unlike inanimate objects and particle matters who are just subject to blind forces of nature. So that was his criticism. I don't think it describes the left of today. So this today's left, if you look at Extinction Rebellion, say, and Justice of Oil, okay, they say listen to the science, meaning climate science, but even then they don't really do that, because climate scientists are not saying, okay, they're saying climate change is a problem, we should do something about it, but they're not usually saying we should drop everything else and dedicate all our energy and resources just to decarbonization. Yeah. So that's not science. That is a hyper alarmist misrepresentation of the science that an actual scientist would dispute, would say, no, that's not what I'm saying. So today's left is mostly, at least at that extreme end, is very post-science and post-rational.
So let's take the left, maybe, who are greater in number and a bit more like, if you use the left-right spectrum, whatever, believe in some sort of need for intervention, but they're probably not going so far as to say switch off coal, switch off fossil fuels tomorrow, like the Gretas. That kind of middle of the bell curve, they and I believe the centre right are guilty of this as well, kind of believe in economics as a science rather than as a hard science rather than a social science. And one of the things I really liked about that Hayek lecture was that he splits out, in physical sciences or hard sciences, you've got a small number of variables, and you can therefore put those variables in and predict the output or predict the outcome. With social science and economics, you've got loads of variables, but the variables interact with each other. And so what you end up is making predictions that are based in nothing.
Yes.
Basically think you can be precisely wrong. Because of X thing, let's say Brexit or whatever, tariffs, GDP in 3.5 years' time will be down 2.874%, and here's my model to show that. Are free market economists as guilty of that and playing that argument back and forth? No, you're wrong. It won't be down 2.47%. It'll be up 3.2% because of this extreme increase in trade or kind of better allocation of labor markets or whatever it might be. So is a scientific behavior, are we playing their game on their turf rather than going, look, you can't predict this? Just let resources be allocated how they should be.
Yeah, so it's generally true that economics nowadays is trying to imitate physics. I mean, that's not new. It's been that way for over half a century. That's why, even though I studied economics, I don't think I would do it again. I didn't enjoy it. It's mostly mathematical modeling. And this isn't a left-right thing. So my economics professors in Berlin were not lefties. Most of them were the sort of people who would probably think it's lowbrow to have a political opinion or to describe your political opinion in any terms. They would say, no, I'm a scientist. Leave me alone with your political rubbish. They would think that's a lowbrow, low status thing to do. So this is generally true that economics has turned into this pale imitation of physics. The big difference being, as you said, forecasts never work. In physics, they do. You can obviously there's always going to be some mistakes because something inevitable, something unexpected happens. But you can model physical outcomes in a way that you can't with economic outcomes, and that's why most economic forecasts turn out to be wrong, or not much better than complicated guesswork. And that's, yes, true of some of the economic schools of thought that would, I guess they wouldn't call themselves that, but that somebody could describe as neoliberal or free market leaning. But it depends on which schools we're talking about. So there is the Chicago school, the Milton Friedman, Gary Becker school. They are very mathematical. They are in that mold. Yes. But there's also the Austrian School of Economics, an older free market school of thought. They've always rejected those methods. So the criticism would not be true if you apply it to them, but it would be true of a standard mainstream economist.
And are you the Kristian Niemitz school of your own school, kind of finding your way, or would you find yourself part of one tradition versus the other?
I simply don't know enough about it to firmly say I'm in this school or that school. So I'd say as a general way to think about economic life, economic principles, you're probably better off with the Austrian school. But some of them are a bit too extreme in rejecting empirical methods entirely. Right. So while it's true that forecasts are usually wrong, that's not what economists should be obsessing about. There are some questions that you can only really work out empirically. So let's say the effect of minimum wages. Okay, you can say in principle we know that if the price of something goes up, demand for it will go down. But then the question becomes, how big is the effect going to be? And is it maybe if you have a large number of people being better paid and a very small number of people either lose their jobs or don't get a job in the first place, is that maybe a trade-off worth making? There you have to put numbers on it, and there you just have to study these things empirically. You have to, and that's what these studies do. They look at, I can't remember which the states were, but there were two neighboring states in the US. One of them either introduced a minimum wage or went above there is a federal minimum wage, but states can go above. One state did that and the other one did not. And then the economists look at what happens at the state border. If you have, say, employers that are relatively similar, one is on this side of the border, the other one on that side, what sort of differences do we observe? And that's something that you can only work out empirically, and that's where the Chicago school clearly has a point. Yeah,
so there's kind of observational differences in the moment that you can make, even if over the long term, let's say, a minimum wage is introduced somewhere, which at the same time sees a huge boost in productivity from an extraneous factor, whatever it might be, exogenous factor, or the right term is, they start, unlocking new technology, or there's, there's cheaper energy that comes in. So all of a sudden, all else being, this is a problem with the Austrian school insofar as that all else being equal, if you introduce a minimum wage, then unemployment will go up. But most of the time in life, all else isn't equal. Other things are happening at the same time. So it can be done, but it's hard, and you have to be cautious about it. But it doesn't lend itself to kind of political commentary, because you hear people arguing about, last quarter our GDP was the highest in the G7 this quarter. So it's just it's tricky kind of setting the boundary of where empiricism can help and not.
Yeah, it's normally useful when you're dealing with magnitude. So it's one thing to identify a cause and effect relation, to say that this causes that, but sometimes you also need to know, okay, how big is the effect, and especially compared with other things that may be happening at the same time. And these are things that you usually can only work out empirically, and that's why a lot of economic papers just take the form of comparing US states. That's where federal systems are brilliant, that you can have neighboring states that are very similar in most regards, but they just have a policy change. One of them introduces a policy, the other one doesn't, and then you can say, let's have a look at what happens in that state compared to the other one. Let's look at the difference in differences. That's when you want to know, for, say, if you put a tax on labor or something, of course you can tell in advance. If you tax something, you will get less of it. But if you're interested in how big is the effect, and does it matter in the grand scheme of things, then you need empirical modeling.
So one thing we can maybe empirically put to bed, and we've talked about it earlier. So I'm holding up a copy of your book here, a nice weighty number called Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. We've acknowledged that true socialism has been tried, or we've put that to bed, despite what many modern believers of socialism would say. It has been tried many times. Is that fair? Has it worked? Has it empirically worked? For the best or for the worse?
Always ended in varying degrees of failure. So there is not. You could, of course, say, so going back to what we talked about earlier, East Germany was not in absolute terms a desperately poor society. You would probably be, so that's why they had on a much smaller scale than West Germany, but they had some immigration even from other socialist states. So they had people from first Vietnam and then Cuba, Mozambique, Angola. For them, I guess it wouldn't have felt poor. They would have thought, well, this is a developed society. But it's always, if you compare it to a realistic counterfactual, then if you compare any socialist economy to a realistic, it doesn't even have to be capitalist, but let's just say mixed economy, market-based economy counterfactual, it's always the more capitalist one that does many times better. And we're not talking about, as with Brexit, a difference of maybe 4% or 5% of GDP, but we're really talking about multiples. In the German case, the difference was that West Germany was about 3 times richer than East Germany in per capita terms, despite the fact that there the division only lasted for a generation, really. And that's just always true wherever we have these easy comparisons, these plausible comparisons, where, say, North and South Korea, where it's basically like a natural experiment, Taiwan versus mainland China in the Maoist period, and Cuba, you could compare to some of the Caribbean islands around it, Puerto Rico. So it started from a similar economic base, but then Puerto Rico being an overseas US territory, they have basically the legal framework of the United States. And it's just always, when you have comparisons of that nature, it's always clear that the more capitalist one, the mixed economy system, is always at least 3 times richer than the socialist one. In some cases, a lot more than that. And if it lasts for long enough, that division and those different economic systems, it will also filter through in differences in life expectancy and pretty much anything else that you may care about, even environmental measures, things that the modern left claims to be so passionate about. That so West Germany, partly by virtue simply of being much richer, was able to introduce environmental protection relatively early on, and they had so the concentration of toxic substances in the soil, the water, the air was much lower than it was in the East, and partly because they could afford to make that trade-off.
Yeah.
They were able to say, well, okay, we may sacrifice a percentage point of GDP here, but actually our quality of life will be higher, so we will make that trade-off. We're happy to do that. Whereas in the East, well, if you're at a level of development where people want to escape because they'd be richer on the other side, you're not so easily placed to do that, and that's just always the case. So if we treated this as something that's empirically verifiable, then it's the results are crystal clear and very unambiguous. That's what makes this special, this comparison of capitalism versus socialism, where with everything else, if we compare, say, Denmark, Sweden to the United States, well, it depends on what you're interested in. It's not that one is obviously better at everything than the other.
Yeah.
If you're interested in equality or that, say, peace of mind of having universal healthcare, then fair enough. Then it's true to say Scandinavia is probably a better place for you than the US. But if it's capitalism versus socialism more broadly, it's completely unambiguous. It doesn't matter what you prioritize, whether that's economic, material factors, material living standards, whether that's social factors, or whether it's environmental.
Do you look into death as well, the kind of the death toll of socialism, or are you trying to take it from a purely economic data perspective?
I've limited it to the economic data, but that's partly because the socialists would, of course, say, well, the deaths, that's got nothing to do with us. That's all because of the not real socialism factor. And there you could get into a kind of tally match where they would say, but capitalism caused the First World War, or capitalism caused colonial exploitation and all that. Where I'm more interested in the economic logic behind it. I would say, I'm sure you can find regimes that had a capitalist economy and that also committed horrific atrocities. I would just say they didn't depend on that. In their case, it was a political choice. They made bad choices, and they could also not have made them.
It wasn't inbuilt into the ideology.
Yes. Whereas with socialism, it very much was.
So you touched on the colonial side of things. Maybe it's a good time to pivot to your latest piece of writing called Imperial Measurement, which I'm holding up for people listening, a cost-benefit analysis of Western colonialism. So you've again taken this from a very economic rather than a moral perspective. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And what made you want, what are the conclusions, let's say? Actually, no, let's start with what made you want to write this, and then we can talk to
so this was purely a response to this BLM mania that we saw in 2020-21, that we just copied and pasted an American culture war, and it was just transcribed onto British soil and continued here, treating Britain again as the 51st state of the US. But then that quickly became a kind of soul-searching exercise of British history. You had this group of activists in Bristol toppling the statue of Robert Colston, was it? Yeah, who was a merchant, but also involved in the slave trade, and that's where he made a lot of his money. And I just realized that these people, some people were treating this as a pure culture war phenomenon and saying, we as economists, we shouldn't even talk about this. This is separate. This is none of our business. But I paid attention to what these people were saying and how they justified their actions, and realized that actually they were making an economic argument. Not in the sense that they would have an opinion on the latest inflation forecasts or the latest OBR forecasts on the deficit or the debt to GDP ratio, but the argument they were making is that these atrocities, the slave trade, colonization, that these were not just bad choices, bad political choices inspired by a form of atavistic nationalism, which is how I would describe them, but that those were that this is how the wealth of the Western world was built. That we grew rich on the basis of plundering the rest of the world, and that's
so basically they came a bit. I mean, reminds me of the conversation I had here with Chris Snowden, where he said basically the health campaigners came onto his turf by talking about the impact of smoking or drinking or whatever it is on the economy, and so therefore he felt compelled to respond.
That's it.
And then the kind of, it sounds very heartless, but if you look at it in economic terms, then smoking is very good for the economy because people die just as they retire, and old people are very expensive. So if you're going to come onto my turf, let's have the argument on our terms, in economic terms, and you want people to die as soon as they stop working is what's good for the economy. So you're basically, you're stepping back from the kind of emotional or the moral arguments about colonialism or imperialism, and going, actually, the West or the colonizer, the recent colonizers, because colonialism has been a feature of history going back for most of our existence as a species. But the wealth has actually not been built from extraction or plundering, but from capitalism and innovation and technology. Is that fair?
That's it. Yes.
Yeah.
So yes, it's very much like in Chris Snowden's case. It's not a debate that I chose. It's the opponent started the culture war, made it about the economics. So then I had to respond, and they started it, and this is my response to that. So if this had been purely a debate about was colonialism bad, was the slave trade bad? Well, that would be kind of pointless. It's not as if anyone today defends the slave trade. It's not as if anyone says, okay, there are people who say the empire wasn't all bad, but even they wouldn't say that Britain should go around today colonizing other parts of the world. So there is no neo-colonialist movement. There's nobody who would say Britain should recolonize India or wherever. So if it's purely about the moral aspect, there isn't really a debate. If it were just that, it would all be kind of pointless. It's an area where there is already universal agreement, but it's precisely the argument of BLM and the various spin-off movements was precisely that this isn't just something where we can say, okay, well, in the past has some dark chapters, shame, but we can't change it anymore, to saying, no, actually, this isn't about the past. This is very much about the present. The wealth that this country enjoys today was built by colonial plunder, by enslaving people, and we can't just brush that aside, according to them, by saying, oh, well, this is the distant past. We've changed our ways. We don't do that stuff anymore. So therefore, today everything's fine. They'd say, no, this is the very foundation of the West's wealth, and I'm just looking at the numbers to the extent that that's possible. Of course, we don't have complete records. It's all rough estimates, but it's just very implausible to say that the colonies, that the empire, that is what made Britain rich, because the numbers are just not big enough to justify such conclusion.
How conclusive are the numbers? Was it a net loss for the West to be, or Britain, let's say, to run an empire? Was it just more expensive versus what it generated? I'm, again, talking coldly in economic terms rather than moral ones, but is the kind of the data slam dunk on that? Or is it at least debatable?
It is debatable, but within a fairly narrow range, and that is a range around the number 0. So it is just about possible that it made a small positive contribution. I think it probably didn't, but that I can't completely rule out. That's still a legitimate reading of the numbers. Mm-hmm. It is also possible, if we look at the lower end of it's all a spectrum of numbers rather than definitive numbers for, say, the amount of money that came in from the colonies. So we have an upper end and a lower end, and then we have to estimate again, okay, how much of that was because of colonialism. So you could say, if you had people traveling to India and buying some spices and tea and whatever, bringing it over here. Not all of that happened only because India was a
happening anyway.
colony. Yeah, so it was there was some trade predating it. Some of it you could say, well, there was trade with Brazil as well, even though it wasn't a colony. So but on a smaller scale maybe than it otherwise would have been. So some of it can be attributed to the fact that India was a colony. Some of it cannot, but we can't say exactly, okay, 45% would have happened anyway, 55% is specifically empire. But yeah, so you're working with a spectrum of possible outcomes, upper limits, lower limits, where you can say, well, it cannot have been more than that, it cannot have been less than that. But with that spectrum, where you end up is you get a range of possible outcomes around the number 0. Just about possible that the empire was a small net gain, also entirely possible and more plausible in my view that it was a net loss, that at least compared to, say, if the alternative had been you dissolve the empire, you grant the colonies independence, or better still, never colonize them in the first place, but you have then lower administrative and military expenditure. You use that for tax cuts or for productive investment, and yes, and you go for a policy of free trade, ideally with everyone, with the neighbors, but also with the the not colonies anymore, the newly liberated or never colonized territories. If that had been the alternative, then I'd say it's fairly clear Britain would have industrialized even faster.
So all the wealth, to summarize it very quickly, all the wealth that we see here relative to many prior colonies is not the function of extraction. That extraction was kind of net, rather we're kind of net neutral basically versus getting extremely rich off the back of colonialism.
That's a fair summary, yes.
What's the response been to this?
Well, hostile as you would expect, but in a strange way. So there has been a leftist academic from somewhere who said, you're just doing this to fight the culture war, where I'm saying, no, the culture war already started. I didn't start it. I didn't start the fire. I'm just responding to it. I'm just not... What happened for the first year or so of the whole BLM madness was that the BLM left, the woke left, were pretty much the only game in town, and they completely monopolized various issues. It's only when somebody fights back,
including economic ones.
That's when this accusation comes up. So I don't accept that. It's the other side that started the culture war, and then if they want a culture war, happy to take part in it.
So so the accusation has been, well, you're just trying to kind of build a profile by being, going on about how awful wokeness is kind of the accusation. Then no one's looked at the arguments and gone, actually, if you take this data and look at that this way, then actually you're wrong. That it's been much more playing the man rather than the ball.
Yes, mostly. Yes, there has been some attempt of nitpicking here and there, but all I'd say done in bad faith.
Okay. So I've obviously got a stack of other books here that you've written. Why don't we kind of zoom out and go to kind of a blank sheet of paper? We'll give you a blank sheet of paper or a blank canvas. You've been living in Britain for a long time, so let's use Britain as our test case. What's Britain's economy like? Does it need fixing, and how would you fix it if it does need fixing?
Well, that's the frustrating bit. In most of the rest of the world, whenever you look at troubled economies, in most cases, fixing them would be very difficult. It would require some difficult institutional reforms that nobody quite knows how to do. I'd say Britain's case is, in a way, frustratingly simple, because the fundamentals are in place. Britain has still a decent institutional framework, and that's a legacy, something that's existed for a long time. And I guess that's why, going back to this, why the Industrial Revolution started here. That Britain was just already at an early stage, quite well developed when it comes to protection of property rights, rule of law, freedom of contract, the fundamentals that make an economy wealthy.
Okay, so let me frame it then. That's quite useful. So there's a great foundation that which makes any kind of repair fairly straightforward, because you're not building the rule of law from scratch.
That's right.
Let's take inflation, for example. So ostensibly, we've just come out of what had been described as an age of deflation, or a low inflation period for 20, 30 years. Now, that is looking at an aggregate index number of, let's say, CPI, RPI, whatever you want to call it. So within that, goods inflation is, yes, absolutely because of globalization or the market and trade and infrastructure got cheaper. But if you take things like healthcare, education, government services, housing, let's take those four things. I would argue they've got A, much more expensive, and B, much shitter in the last 20, 30, 40, if you pick your time frame. And they are the things that are as important as cheap TVs and plastic party balloons that you can get made in China and delivered to you next day by Amazon, which is great. I'm not knocking that importance. But, I see a book here on healthcare, for example. So would you agree with that framing of the economic malaise that we are in?
Essentially, yes. So I'd say healthcare is a bit of a special case. Let's maybe leave that for later. But all the other ones, there is definitely a pattern that the sectors where we've seen the biggest cost increases are the ones that are either provided directly by the state or where the state controls a key input. So housing, that's also one of my ongoing obsessions. And I may have written about this already when you were here. And I've been returning to this on an on and off basis ever since. The inability to build anything, that is the main problem that Britain has. It really is as simple as that. Other economies may have the problem that they try to attract investors, and the investors are reluctant and don't want to invest. Britain has the situation where you have investors queuing up, knocking on the door, begging, basically, please let us invest here. And we're telling them, no, go away. You just can't get permission for anything. It's such
take an example. We've got
such a simple problem.
Yeah, really. Sorry, we've got like a technology like small modular nuclear reactors, which I believe a lot of it was developed here. We've got the ability to do that, to get to net zero very quickly with cheap, clean, abundant, broadly abundant nuclear energy. So all the building blocks are there, but we're buying coal from Norway.
Yes.
Off the grid to kind of stop blackouts.
Yeah.
Is that a political problem or an economic problem or an economic misunderstanding?
It's an economic problem that's politically caused because you just don't get permission to build anything, whether housing or offices or retail space or manufacturing sites or the infrastructure for energy and energy generation and transmission. There's just always some resistance. And you first get the purely political problem of NIMBYism, of MPs, especially in marginal seats, being terrified of local NIMBYs because they're politically active. And then also the judicial process that obstructionist groups, NIMBY groups, would use the judicial process with, launching bad faith lawfare. And thereby blocking or at least slowing projects down, vexatious complaints, in the same way that we get for when it comes to free speech. That also happens, or politically motivated vexatious complaints. That also happens when it comes to shutting things down. And an economy that doesn't build stuff doesn't grow. That's why it's so frustratingly. That's why I say that it's frustratingly simple. That this isn't an economy where you have to somehow lure investors in and try to convince them to invest here. No, they are coming voluntarily. They want to do stuff, and we're just telling them no. So I remember I did a TV interview once on this where it was, well, my presence was kind of pointless because they had given the answer already. They showed a news segment where you had one MP boasting about how they had blocked, I think it was a film studio. Somebody wanted to open a film studio on I think a disused quarry, and there's always examples like that. Something totally ridiculous. It's not even about preserving beautiful nature or anything. It was often some disused car park or whatever. An MP boasting about, I've shut this down. Another MP boasting about how they had shut down a housing project. Another MP boasting about how they had shut down something else, and even things like water reservoirs. There's always somebody against it, blocking it, and MPs then boasting about it. And they showed that news segment about how politicians were blocking things, and then the question to me was, why does the economy not grow? I said, well, you've just given the answer here. My job is done.
So is there a challenge? I'll pose a cultural question which you can not answer if you will stick to the economics, but in Europe at least, Europe's kind of starting to become a bit of a laughing stock. There was a clip recently of a German finance minister trying to smash a bottle of champagne on a ship. Have you seen this?
No.
So there's an EU regulation that has stopped champagne bottles being thrown onto a new ship. It has to be winched it has to be kind of smashed with a safe handheld device that is attached to the ship, and it wouldn't work. And this guy was trying to smash it, and then it was a kind of demonstrative of how we've chosen safety over efficacy or outcomes versus the US, which is much more go, try, fail, doesn't matter if you failed, go again. It's failures to be applauded, and innovation, technology, that kind of frontier spirit. Britain is sort of was the old US in many ways from that perspective, and we're kind of culturally fatigued with going out, and we prefer welfare and comfort to we're happy to cap the upside as long as the downside is kind of with welfare and regulations, no risks are taken.
That is generally a difference between the US and Europe, but I'd say even with the block everything mindset that we have here, I'd say even from a perspective that prioritizes safety over dynamism and long-term prosperity, you wouldn't, even if you take that as given for a moment, you wouldn't end up with the system we have, because quite often newer forms of energy can be safer than old ones. New houses, new buildings can be safer than old ones that they replace. So we're not even prioritizing safety over dynamism. We just mindlessly block stuff, and some of it can be perfectly safe stuff.
So so it's not a cultural problem, or it could partly maybe contributory, but can I put another theory to you then? What you describe as NIMBYs, or voters, particularly in sort of powerful voters, very much in the haves versus the have-nots. So they've got housing, they don't want anything to rock the boat around them. They're the beneficiaries of development around them and an improvement in infrastructure, population growth, technology, but those NIMBYs are effectively rent seekers.
Yes.
So here we go. Is the issue that it's not a capitalism problem, it's a land problem, and you're a NIMBY because your wealth is tied to your ownership of land. And if we can just unlock that by removing the benefits of land speculation, we can disincentivize people just stopping anything that might risk the value of their properties.
I used to think that initially when I started looking into those issues, but I think that's an an economist fallacy to project your economic logic into a NIMBY. I think NIMBYs, from having looked at how they behave, are much less rational than that. They are not rational property wealth maximizers. A lot of them would even deny that, their supply side deniers. They even explicitly argue that supply of housing has nothing to do with the price, and that prices are somehow magically determined, and they're determined by vibes. So they don't see it that way. They wouldn't say, well, I know that this means other people will be stuck in overcrowded accommodation, but I don't care. I only care about my property wealth. They would never say it like that, and probably even to themselves would even if they're behind closed doors. I don't think you would hear them say, okay, now the cameras are off, the microphones are off. Now we can admit all this environmental stuff, landscapes that we talk about, obviously rubbish. We're just talking about our housing wealth. I don't think that's how they roll. I think it's something much more visceral. They are just annoyed by signs of economic life, things happening around them. They just feel entitled to keeping the area as it is now. And at a purely emotional level, I kind of get it when I see so there's often construction around here, and it is irritating sometimes. And you think, well, why are they doing this? And you sometimes do wonder, if I had the power to shut it down, sometimes I'd be tempted to use it, I guess. Especially because then you don't see much of a benefit, and quite often you don't even realize, it's not clear to you what this is all for. And you just have that impulse. And I think NIMBYism is much more visceral, emotional. It's about stopping an annoyance. So
my response to that, and we don't need to kind of disagree too much on this because I think we're broadly aligned, but like the visceral, it's a subconscious calculation of your wealth or any risk to it. Like any change to your surroundings is a risk, even if it's better for the economy as a whole or better for younger people. And I think the kind of the location rents are an issue. So for young people to live and work in London, they'll spend most of their salary effectively on rent and commuting. And not only not on just renting, but the fact that the cost of getting a coffee in London is going to be £2 or £3 more than it is somewhere else, because that cafe has to charge you more.
Yes.
And this is Ricardo's, law of rent, effectively. I'm in a real kind of Georgism phase of my life, and I wanted to use this opportunity to kind of either, to press you on that, and I see the kind of I'm seeing a holy grail solution to kind of our economic malaise being, over time, over 5 years, reducing all tax on capital and wages, and increasing taxes on land values as a way out of this issue, because then land can because of the price inelastic nature of land, you can then unlock land that is currently being held for speculative purposes to be used for what it should be used for, whether it's building housing or laboratory space or warehouses, whatever it might be, rather than just being sat on.
Yeah, but I don't think that's what really happens in Britain. It's not that you have the land available with planning permission and somebody just holding it. There is the issue of land banking, but that is in itself a consequence of the planning restrictions. If you think about, say you're a developer, and you have a certain amount of land with permission, but you have no idea what's going to happen in 5 years, whether you will still secure more land with permission. So you have to kind of spread that out, because you have the you have other costs. You have your workforce, your machinery, and that you can predict in advance. So you will still have that next year and in 2 years' time. It's the land that is the bottleneck, and that you spread out over the years. But it shouldn't say what that means. Land banking isn't that somebody just withholds land and never does anything with it. They might put it to use, say, 2 years or 3 years later than they otherwise would. But that wouldn't explain what I'm looking at is, say, things like if you compare the total housing stock per 1,000 people, number of housing units per 1,000 people. Here versus the EU average, here versus the OECD average, here versus some other economy. Britain is just doing very badly on those comparisons, and it's not that the other places have Georgia's land value taxes. So when it comes to explaining the difference between, so this is something that Britain is doing particularly bad at, when it comes to explaining the difference between an economy where that problem is very, very stark, to economies that are much less affected. The issue of land taxation doesn't really come into it either way.
So it's lower hanging fruit. You can basically ease planning restrictions, and that will enable kind of new supply to come to the market, even if down the line that all ends up in landowners' pockets. But there's benefits that can happen in the nearer term without having to kind of go down the land value tax route.
Well, I think it's not going to end up all in the pockets of landowners. I mean, there is still competition among landowners. In that nowadays we are much more mobile than in the days of Henry George, and different sides do compete with each other. I'm not opposed to a land value tax. I'd say especially. As a way, if we could replace council tax and business rates with a land value tax, that would be a much better solution because of the incentive effects that you would specifically not charge it on the improvements, so you preserve all the incentives to improve the land that you have and do something useful with it, put it to valuable use, and that's all great. Those are all attractive features of a land value tax. So I'm not against it. It's just, I think Georgists become quite quickly sucked into it and become single issuers, and then start writing about how your dating life would be better if we had a land value tax. They become almost like socialists who become who put everything leads back to this one thing for them.
Yeah, it's a grand unifying theory that you kind of you know, and you get that if only you had the gold standard, or if only there's always something that kind of is the root. It's all about money supply, so do you, from an economic theory perspective, the classical school of Adam Smith and David Ricardo would argue that land is a separate factor of production, which is very price inelastic. It's what gets paid first before capital and labour gets paid, and therefore you're always going to get in privately owned, in economies with land as private, where the rent can be delivered to the landowners, you're always going to get this big transfer. So the one compelling argument I heard of this, I don't know if you're familiar with Peter Thiel, but he would say, in the 80s we got this supply side revolution, this kind of one-off deregulatory impulse, which was great, but then that ended up eventually being passed to kind of, that wealth ended up, the wealth creation that came from that over time got concentrated into location rents. And then you had this sort of globalization trend in the 90s and noughties, which created a lot of wealth and prosperity, but that also ended up ultimately going into landowners' pockets, and therefore we could just double down, triple down, and argue for more deregulation, more supply side reform, which is great, lower taxes, cleaner, but that's only ultimately just going to push up land prices unless you address this kind of land issue. So you're not as seduced by that kind of Georgist argument as I am at the moment.
No. I think that's okay. That's a fair description of what happened here in this country, but that's simply because we've constrained the supply of land that you can use, and that's a much bigger factor than the total availability of land. So Georgists, and well, they're not the only ones. There are people who go on about how land is finite and therefore supposedly the land market is so totally different from anything else, but it's not. The total amount of land is that's not even a constraint. There is so much land that isn't being used right now, and that is never going to get used. The total supply is completely irrelevant. We're using such a tiny fraction of the land, other than for agricultural purposes, that I'd say that's just really not an issue. And talking about the US, where at least most states have a more flexible housing market, there it would not be true to say that all the gains from Reaganomics have been capitalized into land value rents. You do get increases in median incomes, and the median income earner is not some super landlord who just owns tons of inner city land and otherwise does nothing. It's true that in Britain, as if you constrain the amount of land that you can effectively use, that is effectively available for economic life, for residential or for business purposes, if you constrain that while you have a growing economy, then yes, that's a windfall gain to the people who already own land, land with planning permission, people who already own business premises or residential houses. So here it has absolutely happened that that there was this mock calculator on I think it was the BBC website, where you can work out, if you're a homeowner, you can work out whether your home earns more than you do. You just put in your postcode and your salary, and it would calculate how you can expect to get a pay rise of this much, and based on the development and property prices in that area, your house is going to gain that much, and it's quite easy to be in a position where the house does earn more than you. But that's not a Georgist issue. That's because we're not building anything, and we've still got this ultra constrained housing supply. Nothing wrong with a land value tax, but it's neither necessary nor sufficient.
Okay, so unlock some supply, that's one solution. Build some more stuff, whether it's infrastructure or nuclear energy. I don't know how big into energy you are, but or some decent energy that isn't sort of a 14th century hamster wheel. What about healthcare? How would you, with a blank sheet of paper, design a healthcare system? Or what examples would you use in the world to kind of create a healthcare system that was effective?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the healthcare book, I'm talking about the private insurance systems in the Netherlands and in Switzerland primarily. There's some other examples as well, but these are the easiest for explanatory purposes. So these are broadly market-based systems. Healthcare is mostly privately provided, and if you need to see a healthcare provider, your health insurer would pay for you for most of it, maybe minus a deductible, rather than paying out of pocket. So it is a market. You can choose among private insurance companies. You can choose among private healthcare providers, but it does have a safety net, which has two components. One of them is there's a premium subsidy. So if you can't afford your health insurance premium, the state would pay it for you. Mm-hmm. But also there is a regulatory system under which health insurers are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of health status. So that's what makes it different from the private health insurance that exists in this country. On top of the NHS or besides the NHS, you can get private health insurance here. It's just that they would charge risk equivalent premiums, meaning it's only really profitable probably if you're relatively healthy and relatively young. And in the systems that I'm talking about, health insurers cannot vary premiums in that way. They have to, for a given insurance product, they have to charge everyone the same premium. And they then have a system where the insurers that end up with a lot of the good risks, the kind of people that you ideally, I guess, want to have, the people who are in great health, who rarely need to use healthcare, the people that cause you low costs. These insurers, the ones that are lucky in that sense, have to compensate the ones that have the higher risks, the more complicated cases, and that have higher expenditure. And the result of that is simply that from an insurer's perspective, it doesn't matter to you whether somebody is 20 years old and in perfect health, or whether someone is 80 years old and needs ongoing medical treatment. Both are equally profitable.
So you get that universality.
Yes.
So by definition, your answer has not been I would create some sort of national health service
No.
that would be free at the point of use and run by the government. Why not? Can you give? I've seen data around used by defenders of the NHS to say that it is the best functioning. I can't remember it, so maybe it's not very good data. But can you explain why you wouldn't carry on with the National Health Service as it is?
Well, I'd say healthcare is ultimately not that different from other goods and services. It's basically a sector of the economy like any other, and it would be very strange if you said, well, in this sector, all the standard economics, everything that I normally believe in, that competition is a good thing, that consumer choice is a good thing, that somehow no longer applies. It's basically a market like any other. And if you have a state monopoly provider, you are losing a lot of the benefits that you get in a competitive sector, and that's also true in healthcare. So it's not that different, and we see that in the data that the NHS, insofar as we have measurable healthcare outcome data, the NHS is clearly quite far behind the systems that I'm comparing it to. It has worse clinical outcomes and longer waiting times, and that was just never very different. So we have time series going back for quite a while, and for as long as we have data, that's always been the case. We make the mistake of unduly focusing on this one outlier system, which is the US, when there are really good examples of functioning private health insurance systems.
And the US is not a private system. It's very state involved. Is that right?
Well, it's basically every kind of mechanism to deliver healthcare exists in the US. So they have really multiple parallel systems. They have a private insurance sector, and that covers about 60% of the population. So mostly that's the working age, the non-poor working age population. They have private insurance. So they have that. But they also have state insurers, Medicaid and Medicare. So they would not provide their own healthcare, but they would be monopolists for a particular group, say if you're poor and you're entitled to Medicaid, you can't choose an alternative health insurer. For you in that situation, they are a monopolist. So they have that, and they also have for army veterans in particular, they also have state-run healthcare facilities. So they have like that would be like a mini NHS. You have state health insurers like in Canada, and you have private insurance, all side by side, and none of those different parallel systems really work very well. So I think it's a bit of a red herring to just point at the private insurance part and say, that must be the problem. Right. That is the part that's not working. It's the whole system that even the more state-dominated parts, which has that problem. So
it's a great PR coup for defenders of the NHS to, whenever an alternative is discussed, to bring images of people's minds of a certain subset of American healthcare and ignore or forego what is happening in Europe or Asia. Your solution, is there an issue, this comes up a bit in conversation with kind of healthier people I know, where there's a frustration with moral hazard, where sort of bad choices, healthcare choices made by people are paid for by, a nationalised or universal healthcare system. So if I smoke and drink and eat junk food all day for 30 years, the taxpayer or the health insurer has to foot the bill. Is that something that you've thought about as an issue? Or is it just, it's a minor issue compared to the state of healthcare at the moment?
Mostly that. I'd say it's true in principle, whether you have a national health service or the kind of non-discriminatory insurance system that I'm talking about. There, it's also true that if somebody smokes or eats fast food every day, the insurer couldn't say, we're going to charge you more now. There's no risk surcharges, so it's also true in that system that the cost of that is collectivized. But I'd say two things. The first one is, we've touched upon this briefly, Chris Snowden's argument. He looks at lifetime healthcare costs and shows that it's really the people who live healthy lives who, over a lifetime basis, have the highest healthcare costs, simply because they are more likely to reach the age when you develop the complex chronic conditions that are very labor intensive to. Well, it's not even treat, because you can't treat them in the sense of make them go away. You have to. It's more like an ongoing management thing. Yes. And so there is that. It's not really true that you impose costs on other people. But even if it were true, I would just say, well, if we want a universal system, then that's something that we just have to live with. And that's an issue where I'm not a purist libertarian. If you're a purist libertarian, you're going to say, I shouldn't be forced to subsidize other people's healthcare costs. And if other people make bad lifestyle choices, then they should pay the extra insurance premium that you would have in a pure market system, where, unlike in my system, the premiums in my system the premiums don't vary between different risk groups. In a pure market system, they would. So a more purist libertarian would want a system of that kind, where there is no collectivization of healthcare costs except the unexpected ones. So that's of course the purpose of all insurance, to collectivize costs that you cannot anticipate. So if you walk out of this building, you get run over by a car. Let's hope that doesn't happen, but that would be a purely unexpected risk. That's the purpose of insurance, and that nobody can anticipate. But if, say, after walking out of here, you go to the next KFC and buy 3 packs of cigarettes on the way there, okay, that's if you do that all the time, that is a predictable cost, at least in the short term. It might shorten your lifetime healthcare costs, but for now it's going to increase costs. That is predictable. I'd say if we want a universal system where people who are people in bad health can get healthcare coverage as easily as anyone else, we just have to accept that also means there's going to be an element of free riding. Then if we want to cover the people who have higher healthcare costs for reasons they can't control and can't influence, genetic factors, hereditary factors, if we want those people covered, we have to accept that
there's going to be an element of socialization.
Yeah.
So are you interested in, you're an ideas man, are you interested in how to get from the NHS to universal healthcare without the NHS, which is the name of your book here, towards a patient-centered health system? Are you interested, or are you just solely interested in, look, here's a solution, I don't care how you get there, it's up to media or podcasters or politicians or people like me to figure out the answer?
No, I have a paper on this from last year, where this is about the transition. This is, you're starting where you are and you want to be there.
So this is
how does that path look like?
The denationalisation of healthcare, how to replace the NHS with a social health insurance model. So you do care about the politics, PR, art of the possible, the shifting of the Overton window side of things, as well as the kind of economic theory.
Yes, I do now. I didn't very much when I wrote the book, because back then, this is 2016 when it came out, back then there was basically nobody else who talked about alternative to the NHS. That was such that would have been like talking about, say, what the Adam Smith Institute did, privatizing the moon, an idea that is deliberately wacky and mostly to troll the Guardian, I guess. It was very easy, and it was just so out there that to talk about the practicalities, what would that look like on a step-by-step basis, would have been a kind of an overkill. It was just not necessary at that stage. Mm-hmm. Over the past 2 or 3 years, that's changed. You can now quite regularly see people in at least the right-wing press, Telegraph, Spectator, criticizing the NHS at a fairly fundamental level, not saying we need a better health secretary or we need a better NHS
resource
CEO. But they would say, no, there are systems elsewhere that deliver better outcomes. The one that we have here is rubbish. So that's become a much more acceptable argument. And now it makes sense to therefore go more into the practicalities and talk about what the transition would look like, if that's what you wanted, because you could easily end up with, I'm guessing a lot of people who read these articles probably think, okay, this sounds plausible to me. If we could wave a magic wand and replace our system with the kind of system that they're talking about there, whether that is the Dutch one or well, quite often they wouldn't even be that specific, but they would, in broad terms, talk about a social health insurance system, a universal health insurance system. I guess a lot of readers of these articles will probably think, this sounds good to me. If we could somehow make it happen, I'm all for it. But how? And it is a fair question, because health systems are just very difficult to change on a fundamental basis. So quite often it's a once in a lifetime choice, once in the lifetime of a nation, that fairly early on you settle for a particular healthcare model and it just stays there, and you get path dependency. I'm looking at some examples of where that has actually happened, so it's not completely unprecedented.
Okay. Do you therefore kind of sat here in Westminster, you see politicians walking past or in the pub or coming to events here? How do you feel when you're kind of watching them, looking at them like little zoo animals, talking to each other about, such kind of minor issues or kind of window dressing or things that are there to score points or win arguments rather than talk about ideas or find truth or find better outcomes? Is it just part of the nature of discourse and you just deal with it, or do you get, come on guys, or actually are they really willing to learn and listen and go, actually this is really helpful, let me try and talk to someone in Whitehall or wherever it is about this?
I don't really talk to politicians very much. I'm a more purist ivory tower kind of guy. I write about my ideas. If somebody invites me to talk about them, I happily go there and make the argument. Happy to take questions and discuss it.
But you care, right? You want this to happen. You're not writing this just for the sake of sort of mental masturbation. It is a outcome.
No, absolutely. I want us to see ideally.
You must therefore get a sense of frustration reading a copy of the mainstream newspaper or the BBC or whatever it is when you're looking at the health discussion and it is about, the spending's not enough or the wrong person's in charge or they're not, the procurement is kind of needs tweaking or they need better IT or whatever.
Yeah.
It must rankle you a bit.
It did for a while. You just get used to it over time that on a lot of issues that your thinking is just far removed from the mainstream and that's just the way it is. And I guess if you expected to see policy changes because you've written a paper on something, then you would get frustrated pretty quickly. That's just not how it works. So if you want to be in the world of ideas, which is what a think tank is, then you just have to have that perspective and have a certain ideas purism and saying I'm saying what's right.
So you've spent some time in South America. You worked at the central bank. Was it Paraguay or Peru?
It was the Statistics Office of Paraguay the Central Bank of Bolivia.
Of Bolivia, sorry. So I've never been to South America, so I'm going to do an overgeneralization and faux pas by asking you about Argentina, even though you've not done any professional work in there. I'll chat about politicians and the kind of lack of first principles thinking and ideas and a greater emphasis on point scoring, winning arguments, popularity, profile building. I listened to Javier Milei on a 3-hour interview with Lex Friedman, but it was published 2 or 3 months ago. And even if you don't like anything that he's saying or what he's believing in, he explained his first principles thinking of, this is what I read, this is what I believe, this is what I've experienced, this is how I've come to where I am now, and this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. Is that are you excited about that, or do you try not to get excited about things like that?
I try not to, because I simply don't know enough about the Argentinian political system and whether he has a chance to keep going in the way he does. But I've seen some of those videos too, and he is, yes, an absolutely, he's a very unusual politician. Yeah. He's much more, his mentality, he's much more like a think tanker. Yeah. He thinks about stuff from first principles and thinks things through, and he can explain them very well. He explains them like an economist, and that's just very unusual. I think even Thatcher and Reagan were not quite like that. Even they had to maybe mix their economic liberalism with something else, and maybe appeal to a sense of nationalism as well, and maybe frame their ideas in such a way that somebody who isn't interested in classical liberal economics could still sympathize with them, simply because otherwise he won't get elected. There's not enough of them. Javier Milei is very unusual in that regard. Yes, it's. I've never seen a politician explain economics in such a great way.
And it's early days. Obviously, it's only a year or so, but he's effectively carrying out a free market wet dream in terms of like just ending departments, slashing spending, and we kind of. Do you find you kind of wake up here thinking, I wish we would at least be talking about this here? Is it?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and ideally, I'd love to have a political landscape where somebody like Milei can thrive. But then again, it wouldn't do to just slag off politicians, and they like everyone else respond to incentives, and they just had. So what I didn't know until Milei became president is that in their case he didn't suddenly come out of nowhere. It's not just that he did the chainsaw wielding and therefore by being flamboyant and charismatic that he's just a one-man show. They had free market think tanks. They're not internationally well known, but some of them have in hindsight become a bit more well known because of people asking, where does this suddenly come from, this Milei phenomenon? And they had I guess you could say very IEA like think tanks in Buenos Aires, where they prepared the ground by making arguments, I guess initially maybe to a small and nerdy audience, but then getting media exposure and explaining these things. They've obviously not persuaded everybody, but they have enough opinion formers on their side and enough people who kind of get it and are prepared to give this a chance. And without that, he would just be some fringe outsider. So it is an example of where the ground has been prepared. You have people who understand classical liberal ideas properly, explain them well, and then you also have a sense of economic crisis and a sense of we have to try something else. Yeah,
and then also someone with a grounding and charisma to kind of execute that. And looking at recent politicians here, I think what I've learned is the messenger is you need the message, but the messenger is also very important. So let's not talk about education or the education system, because I'm guessing it maps quite closely to how you view the healthcare system in many ways. And it's the same issue there's no choice, state controlled. If you could, and I know free market economists hate being given magic power to do what they want, but if you could impart economic knowledge to school children, what would you like them? What fundamentals or basics would you like them to know, or do you think they only really experience it by going into the real world and kind of exploring ideas themselves?
No, I don't think you do. You can have different people who have the same experience, but nonetheless interpreting it in completely different ways and coming to very different conclusions. You still need some theoretical framework, and that's what I mentioned in the introduction. That when I became more appreciative of markets, of market competition, it's not that my life experience suddenly changed. What changed was the way in which I interpreted things. That I saw, say, competition between 2 or 3 breweries, where I would previously have just thought, a new beer, great, I'll try that. And then afterwards, I suddenly started to think, wait, I get what's happening here. This brewery launched a new beer, it's very popular, so the other brewery now has to respond to it and either come up with a new product of their own, or lower their prices, or do something else to attract customers. And it's the theory that makes you interpret the things that you see around you in different ways. The experience itself doesn't add very much. So I've had that experience observing market competition and wealth generating activities all the time, long before, even in the confused commie phase. Just didn't have the toolkit to analyze that stuff properly and realize what's happening. And I guess a publication like that should maybe be available in schools.
And you're very good at observing the public zeitgeist on Twitter or X in a very amusing way. So you're kind of, I would recommend everyone follow you, and you do have a big following. What is your approach to that medium? What are you doing? Is it just fun? Are you just trolling? No, I'm not calling you a troll, but are you just enjoying yourself on there, or is it a way to get a message across through mockery or kind of display of inanity?
It's a lot of both. So I mean, I wouldn't mind being described as a troll. There's some trolling can be a way of communicating and engaging in a humorous way, and that trolling doesn't have to be vicious and personal. So I don't do that kind of trolling, but I do make fun of bad ideas and showing the absurdity. And if somebody wants to describe that as trolling, then fair enough. It is a very entertaining medium. But say,
what do you find entertaining about it?
Well, it's a bit of a freak show that you see the daftest opinions expressed with such supreme confidence. And that's also what sometimes gets me. That's sometimes maybe the most annoying aspect of Twitter, that you have people who clearly have no idea what they're talking about, but who are nonetheless super confident. That's maybe the worst aspect, that hyper confidence, and maybe that's where a bit of gentle trolling can be a bit of an antidote. But yes, it's I don't usually use it to talk about random stuff, although that might also happen when I'm on the district line and it's not moving. I might tweet about my frustration with that. But 90% of it would be, in the broadest sense, about political ideas.
Looking at something that some socialists have said and about Jeremy Corbyn or whatever it is, and
that can be a conversation opener, and ideally it should work at more than one level. At Twitter, so you can see the immediate funny side of it, but then if you're interested in it, there is also a wider set of ideas involved, and for those who are interested in it, they can then go on.
Separate to economics, you're a researcher. You're looking at vast tracks of work by people like, you've done your work on Marx, Adam Smith, the Austrian school, and also, various economic signals and data happening around the world. Have you found AI has changed the way you work at all yet? Or are you trying to kind of, in either kind of processing data, accessing information, kind of chucking in, testing ideas? To give you an example, I put in to ChatGPT, what should I ask Kristian Niemitz? Mm-hmm. And it came out with some not bad questions, none of which I've used, just in case anyone thinks I'm being lazy. But I kind of then asked it, well, what would he, does he really believe this, or what's the source for that? Where does this come from? Or what would he say if I said this? And it was quite a useful kind of idea testing mechanism. But also, could it be useful for, you've got this treasure trove of IEA work, finding quick answers to questions. Have you found it useful yet, or are you not?
I haven't yet, but that's mostly my own fault, my own laziness for not trying to figure out how it works. So I've so far only used AI for creating funny images. Quite often, well, at least funny to me, probably not to anyone else. But that doesn't mean I'll stop using them. So to illustrate blog posts, you have some economic idea that's embedded in it, and you try to compress that into an image for that. But that's more entertainment than actual research. It's kind of peripheral to it. And I know a lot of people use it for routine writing to get rid of the annoying bits where you're just saying something that's it's not about creativity or self-expression, but it's just some routine chore. But where that doesn't, I mean, I write every day, so that's something where it wouldn't really make much of a difference. It's not that I'm ever sitting there looking at a blank screen and thinking, oh no, how should I say that? That would be, if you write all the time, that comes quite naturally. So on that side, I haven't seen much of an advantage. But I'm sure for summarizing things, when you don't have the time to read a full publication, must be massively useful. And it's mostly my own laziness for not having figured it out yet.
So if you're writing all the time, you must be reading all the time. But how do you choose what to read? Or is it something that catches your interest? How much of it is sort of recent stuff versus kind of big, heavy, let's read Wealth of Nations again for the 8th time, or whatever it is? How do you pick what to kind of put into your brain to therefore spit out interesting stuff?
So I'm not following current affairs very much. So if you ask me what's been on the news today, I have no idea. It's much more indirect that I find out about the stuff. And their Twitter is extremely useful, that other people are much more plugged into the political process and what's the latest policy proposal. And I find that out through Twitter.
Yeah.
And then when I'm interested in something, then before I do my own writing on it, then I would want to know, say somebody comes up with a policy proposal, I'd look at, has this ever been tried before? Is there a prehistory? And then you might go back all the way to Adam Smith again.
Yeah. So as you know, I like to wrap these conversations up with something I call the long bet. So you've got a 10-year time horizon to make a prediction of something that you think will happen or would like to happen, and it's nothing serious. It can be anything you like, a bit of fun, and if we sit down in 5 years' time again, we can kind of see how that prediction's going, and halfway through. So if you've got anything that you'd like to predict, then yeah, now's your chance.
So is this about what I would want to happen or what I think will happen? Because
both. You can do either both, or I know economists have a kind of forecasting tendency. So why not get it out in a harmless setting where the impact is not going to be put into practice necessarily? Yeah. So it's a way of kind of going to a football stadium and shouting at people and getting out that, that kind of animal instinct.
Yeah. Well, what I want to happen and what I think will happen are two very different things. I'm a massive pessimist when it comes to political developments. Okay. I think the world will, in overall terms, become a better place because, going back to Adam Smith, there's a lot of ruin in the nation, and nowadays there's a lot of ruin in the world. A lot of global trends on prosperity and social outcomes indicators are improving, but mostly despite politics rather than because of it. And I think that will continue, and it's just difficult once you have a capitalist economy going. It's difficult to completely mess it up, even if you have terrible politics. And in most places, politics is terrible. So I'm not holding out for 100 Mileis taking over everywhere and reforming things in a direction that I'd like to see.
So is that the beauty of the free market, is that you don't need good leaders, whereas in an autocracy you kind of beholden to how good the leaders, the public needs to be paranoid and aware of a slide back to authoritarianism or kind of state controlled planning, but as long as that paranoia is ever present, it'll stop you sliding there, and in the meantime you can get successive incompetence, and you'll still kind of carry on progressing.
Up to a point, yes. So you can definitely mess up economic life. You can definitely have politicians making terrible choices and messing things up. So a capitalist economy is fairly resilient. It can withstand quite a lot of bad policies, quite a lot of stupidity imposed on it, and it can still function. And that's one of the great things about it. You don't need, as you said, leaders in charge who perfectly understand the system and who get everything right. even even some fairly badly governed places. I mean, Italy has long been a byword for political corruption, and Italians of most political persuasions hate their political class. If you talk to them, are quite pessimistic, and of course they have problems, but it is still it's clearly not a hellhole, and at least the north of the country is still very prosperous. So that shows there is some resilience in a market economy. It can withstand quite a lot of bad things happening. It can, however, also reach a stage where that's no longer true. What I've talked about in Britain, where we have this NIMBYocracy, NIMBYism driving the political process. When that happens, then it can reach a stage where the market economy can just no longer function. I'd say here we have that issue. That's the reason why the economy just isn't progressing. We just have a political system that shuts down progress, and there's just no way around that. What I would like to see, going back to the original question, would be I'd love to see the political left lose their cultural hegemonic status. Even if that means, even if they're not replaced by something that I particularly like, I just like a situation where you have 2 or 3 or 4 political ideological camps that are roughly of equal strength in. I'm not talking about political parties here. I'm not talking about a composition of the House of Commons or anything, but just, we had this issue during the last decade. We've had a conservative government the whole time, or conservative-led governments. It just didn't feel that way. It didn't feel like you live in a conservative, in a country that's governed in a conservative way, or that's moving in a more conservative direction. You had a system where...
So is that Gramsci's biggest success?
I guess you had a general left-dominated zeitgeist, the opinion formers, the intellectuals being mostly left-wing, all the political energy being on the left. You had, say, for a while, Corbynism pretty much absorbed the entire political energy. All the enthusiasm was there. And then you had Theresa May, notionally in government, but
just
academia, absolutely
the media,
zero enthusiasm about it. And then you just get... a political right that is notionally in government, but kind of suffering from imposter syndrome, thinking the whole country hates us, we shouldn't be here, we're on the wrong side of history, we're the baddies, and therefore they're just waving through net zero, governing in a self-hating way. You can have that distinction. That's what Britain was like in the last decade, and so far this one too. And I'd like to see just a competition of ideologies where you have several camps that are where none completely dominates, where there is just a bit of an equilibrium. It would, of course, be even better if classical liberals won the upper hand, but that's utopian. I'm not foreseeing that would happen. But if we just had a setup where different political, cultural forces more or less neutralize each other, because none is strong enough to completely dominate the others, that could be a setting in which classical liberals have a role to play, because there we would be able to say, well, on this issue, that side is right. On a different issue, that side is right. We're not really part of either camp, but we're sort of there in every debate and always somewhat represented. That would be a pretty good outcome. But it's not a forecast. It's not what I think will happen. I could quite easily imagine that we will see a repetition, something like the Corbyn project happening again, because we have seen that, well, what happened in 2015 was simply that that enthusiasm that suddenly sprang up around him, this youth movement, seemingly completely coming out of nowhere. Suddenly he was all the rage, and then you had people in Glastonbury chanting his name, and this personality cult, and this can absolutely happen again.
Yeah.
So I would not, too many people on my side of or our side of the argument make the mistake of treating that as a freak event, as something that happened once in a lifetime, and now that he is gone, backbencher, that can never happen again. No, I'd say the lesson that we should learn from this is, look at how little it took. And Corbyn is really not a charismatic figure, and certainly not a great thinker or anything. He was just a vehicle, an outlet for a latent demand that was already there. And if it took so little last time, it doesn't have to take a lot next time. So something like that can very easily happen again.
So someone with a bit of charisma could be even more dangerous. Yes. I'm hoping you're actually, with your prediction or what you'd like, with the improvements in technology or communication technology, IT, that we're now a level playing field in terms of the media. So before there was a heavily gatekeepered, institution, legacy media that control the kind of pipe of ideas and discussions. And now with podcasts and social media, you're going to see more camps, hopefully with different audiences that kind of collide every now and then. So that could be something that does happen. On your point about Corbyn, is it not just the case that the young affluent are just a bit lefty, like you were? And, when they get kids and own a business or start paying tax, that'll kind of...
That's the whole problem. I've written about this here. That's left turn ahead. I'm going through a number of surveys because for every individual survey you could say, well, maybe that's because of the way the question is phrased, whatever. But what we see now, that young people are so overwhelmingly left-wing, it's not simply a repetition or a continuation of something that's always happened. It really is true that over the course of the last decade, the millennial generation has moved massively to the left in ways, I wouldn't say it's unprecedented, but it's not been the case in, say, with Generation X in the 80s.
But is it reactionary? Is that our prior generation was really kind of Thatcherite, the 80s, they had the day of media and kind of the city and this, that and the other, and we're kind of we're just rebelling against our parents a bit, who kind of did quite well out of Reaganism or Thatcherism.
Well, but is it...
I've got no data.
It was more balanced in the 80s. It's not that the young were predominantly Thatcherite. It's just that being a young Thatcherite would not have been a super exotic outsider position. Right. So even then, with the exception of, I think, the 1983 election, it was always slightly, the young were slightly more left-wing. Even then, it's just that in the 80s, you could have said at university... yes, I'm a Thatcherite, and you would not have been the only one probably. Whereas now, the Telegraph did a mini documentary about young conservative students, and it was all about how they were basically the only ones, and that everyone around them thinks that they're super weird. So that really is a change. But the biggest change, I'd say, is that nowadays it's not the very young that we're talking about here. It's people in their 30s, I guess now 40s as well. So you can no longer apply this logic of, oh, well, it's just teenagers. It's just like the young Niemitz. Well, I was 17 at the time, so that's more, it's more plausible to say that's a phase and he'll grow out of it, and I did. But if somebody is in their late 30s and there's massive Corbynistas, they're not going to grow out of it. If it hasn't happened by that stage, it's not going to happen.
And is that partly because socialism is a history lesson now rather than a living memory or a living competitive ideology that crumbled in the eyes of people in front of them, literally in wall form?
Yes.
Whereas now it's it's just another thing that people don't know about in their own history. And so these ideas need to be retested, not socialism, but that kind of the free market idea needs to be restated to save us having to go through that experiment again.
I think that is part of it. You definitely see, it's not that there's a break in the data, that there's one birth cohort that thinks completely different from the cohort just above, but you see something of a turning point around the time where people still have memories of, well, either the Cold War itself, maybe fall of the Berlin Wall, or at least the period immediately after with this end of history feeling. The feeling that we've tested this to destruction, and you just had a collapse of socialist systems around the world, and it was just in the 90s that there was a sense of, okay, we can disagree about lots of things, but a successful economy has to be mainly a market-based economy, and that's just something that left and right could agree on, even if there'd be differences in how they interpret that and what they want to do within a capitalist system. And that's something that is just no longer present today.
Yeah.
And I would add to that even at the time there were, of course, and I remember this when I was at school, it's probably what I would have said as well, there were people who said, well, they've just not done socialism properly and that's the whole problem. But there is still a difference when, say, if you can still see the failed experiments with your own eyes in front of you, it's just a bit less believable if somebody says, trust me, that doesn't mean anything, I will do it differently.
Yeah.
That's a lot more plausible when they are distancing themselves from something that is already distant, if that makes sense. If you no longer have a visual reminder, this is how planned economies play out. And I guess to my younger Zoomer colleagues, for example, the idea that Poland or Lithuania are poor countries, to them that would sound weird. They would just think of them as holiday destinations in the same way as they think about the Mediterranean. Whereas for Generation X, for my generation, yes, we would absolutely still have thought of Eastern Europe as poor.
And so in communists, we'd have that communist legacy would be hanging over them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it sounds like the first place people should start if they are going to read your work in the threat of that is this one. Socialism.
Depends what they're interested in, but can't go wrong with that.
Why don't I focus on that one? Because we're finishing on that. So Kristian Niemitz, Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. It looks very, very meaty and interesting. Where can people find you on X? What's your handle?
It's K_Niemitz, NIEMIETZ.
Great. And please check out the Institute of Economic Affairs as well, which is where you've worked for a while. And
where that's all available for download.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kristian. See you soon.
Pleasure. Absolutely.
This has been Meeting People. I've been your host, Amal Pandya. This is a podcast produced by Matt Cooper with music composed by Loverman.